everybody. This lecture is about race and racism in cultural context. By now you've already been learning about the subject of race from the perspective of the other subfields. I'm going to talk about race and racism from the perspective of cultural anthropology. And I hope you'll see some overlap in what we talk about here, as well as some distinctions in terms of what the focus is of each of the three subfields. And how hopefully they sort of, when you bring them all together, they give you that more well-rounded, more holistic view of this very complex subject of race, racial categories, racial identities, and the fact of racism and inequities around race as they manifest in the United States and other places in the world. So that's sort of the set of topics that we're going to be talking about today. So I wanted to start with just a really sort of baseline concept in terms of how cultural anthropologists think and study and present ideas around race. And that's the basic idea that race is a socially constructed set of categories. We're going to talk more about what I mean by that along the course of this lecture. But the basic concept here is that race is not a biological phenomenon. It's a cultural phenomenon. And it's a way in which people in various places and at various moments in time have projected a set of distinctions onto human physical variation. So those categories are not rooted in nature or rooted in our biological variation. They are rooted in the cultures in which those categories arise, and then they are sort of thrust onto cultural variation and come to be something that people understand to be the way that people are organized into groups, etc., even as it's something that we can, if we step back from it and start studying it, as we're again going to talk about in this lecture, we can see the ways in which those categories are constructed, fabricated over time. So that's a lot of what we'll be talking about. One of the key ways that we know that racial categories are constructed is by being able to see that they vary from place to place and that they change over time. Okay, so there's nothing really stable about race categories or racial identities. It's something that shifts. So we'll look in this lecture both at a sort of cross-cultural comparison between two places in the world, and also we'll look a little bit historically at how ideas about race have changed over time and where some of the assumptions about race in the United States come from. So I wanted to sort of shift a little bit now to where anthropology comes into all of this, and particularly where cultural anthropology comes into all of this. And one figure to begin with to talk about that is a cultural anthropologist named Franz Boas. He is by many considered to be the founder of modern American anthropology. He was a cultural anthropologist who did a lot of field research, particularly with Native American groups in the United States. And he was one of the sort of first modern anthropologists, right, actual researcher anthropologists, to really challenge biological explanations for human behavior and for human differences. And he was indeed one of the anthropologists who first developed the notion of cultural relativism. That is, that all populations of people, all societies, all cultures are equally complex, worthy of our attention, worthy of dignity and respect. And again, working in the era that he did at the turn of the 20th century, Boas's ideas were quite radical. But his approach to cross-cultural study and to sort of human variation and the idea of cultural relativism have continued to have long-standing influence within the field of anthropology. So even in the sort of modern era, you can see, for example, in the Statement on Race by the American Anthropological Association, which is the sort of major professional organization for anthropologists in the United States, part of that statement on race reads, "Physical variations in the human species have no meaning except the social ones that humans put on them." So again, this idea that cultural differences, including those around race and ethnicity, are cultural constructions and do not indicate any something to do with value or civilization or advancement was part of the agenda of Franz Boas and the other cultural anthropologists who came after him. So he's an important sort of figure in terms of laying the groundwork early in the field of anthropology for what the ethos of the field would be around these questions of difference. Okay, so let's sort of think in a more contemporary context then about differences in ideas about race and how ideas about race shift over time. I've stressed to now that race is not a biological concept, that is a culturally constructed set of categories. But I want to also make it clear that what I'm saying here is not that race is not something that exists, right? Or that it's something we don't need to think about. Because it does exist in the sense that ideas about race, categories associated with race, identities associated with race are really powerful and influence people's lives on a daily basis. But the distinction I'm trying to make here is that those powerful categories and experiences and identities are social phenomena, not biological ones. So we need to address them for what they are, right? So we do need to think about how race is enacted in the United States, but we need to understand that the lens to use for that is a sociocultural lens and not a biological lens, if we really want to understand what's going on. We can see that race categories are constructed when we compare both how they change over time, historically, and how they vary across space, meaning when we do a cross-cultural comparison. So I want to give you an example of each of those, just to demonstrate, again, those kinds of variations. The U.S. Census is an interesting place to look, to think about how racial and ethnic categories change over time. You're probably familiar with the census. We just filled one out fairly recently. It's every 10 years. And the U.S. government has been pretty consistent with doing this sort of survey of who lives in the U.S. every 10 years for a long time, right? Since the beginning of the census, there's always been questions about the race and ethnicity of the respondents to the census. So one interesting thing we can do to sort of understand how categories connected to these identities change over time is to look back at the categories that are included on the census form. If you filled out a census form before, or you looked at one, you've probably noticed that there's usually a bunch of categories that you can check, right? And sometimes you can write something in, but it's always sort of trying to get at people's heritage or identity, right? So these are some examples from those census questions about race and ethnicity over time. Starting in the 1880s, I have a sort of several sessions of the census. I didn't put every single one on here, but sort of periodic information from the census forms over time. And what you can see is that the nature of the categories and the number of categories change over time. And some of these categories are ones that we no longer recognize, that mean nothing to us from the vantage of, of the 2020s, right, of 2022. Others we might think of more as ethnicity versus race, etc. So the point is not that any of these categories is more correct or more accurate than any other, but that the fact that they shift over time and that these were the categories that made sense to people in that moment and no longer make sense to us should be a real flag to us to say, oh, clearly there's nothing essential about these categories. These are categories that are constructed in a moment of time and reflect the social and cultural dynamics of that moment. So these are the historical ones, and this is the modern form, right? One of the things that's also interesting to look at as the census form sort of shifts over time is to what extent people are able to choose to self-identify in more nuanced ways. So, for example, the instructions for these questions on the earlier forms used to be pick one, right? So you really had to put yourself in one of the boxes. This modern form, now the instructions are mark one or more boxes. So, in fact, there is a bit more nuance in how people can self-identify. One of the things you read, the article by Fish, also helps us try to understand the constructedness of race categories. And it does so by comparing race categories in the US versus in the country of Brazil in South America. So what we get from this article is sort of culturally specific models of race. And what you see from Fish's comparison is that the categories utilized in the United States are more fixed, that is, they're less changeable over time in the life of a person, and also that they're more based on concepts of heritage or who your parents were, right? Whereas the categories utilized in Brazil are more flexible and they're more focused on appearance, what somebody looks like, regardless of who their parents may have been, right? So the two models, right, the two culturally specific models of race that Fish describes, for the U.S., he refers to it as the concept of hypodescent. And for the Brazilian case, he refers to it as tipos, right, or types. So the U.S. concept of hypodescent, what that means, and again, this is not to say that this has any sort of truth to it, right, in the sense of being some kind of neutral fact. But it's the notion of hypodescent is a cultural model, right? So the logic of it is something that's specific to a particular cultural world. So the notion of hypodescent is that somebody whose parents come from different racial or ethnic groups, the child will be categorized with the identity of the parent, the identity that is of lower status. Okay, hypodescent. So, for example, in the United States, typically somebody who has one parent who's identified as white and one parent who's identified as African American, the child of those parents will be categorized as African American, right? That's the rule of hypodescent, or the logic of hypodescent, which, again, doesn't particularly make any sense, right? It only makes sense in that cultural world where there's that understanding of what heritage and race mean, right? In contrast, what Fish finds when looking into these Brazilian tipos is that people in Brazil are described in terms of their sort of racial identity, are described much more in terms of what they look like, not necessarily who their parents are. So in other words, children of the same set of parents, of the same two parents, may be described as having different racial identities, right? If one has lighter skin or one has darker skin. So it's not about who you came from as much as what you look like. And then even that description is often a little bit flexible. So you might be described in different ways on different days or by different people, right? So it's a more flexible, a more fluid notion of racial identity. Now, that said, there's lots of evidence from all the researchers who work in Brazil that there's still racism evident in Brazilian society. And that particularly people of African descent in Brazil often find themselves economically and politically disadvantaged. So it's not that it's sort of utopia, right? Where because race categories are flexible, it means, you know, everybody's considered to be equal. Unfortunately, that's not the case. So the ways that racism plays out are different than the ways it plays out in the United States, but there are still those inequities based on identity tied to appearance and ideas about race. So the thing I want to end on then is the second thing that you read, which is Garth's article, which really is about how race and racism manifest in the United States, particularly in the very recent era, the last few years. So this is a really sort of recent article that's analyzing both responses to police violence in the United States, particularly the Black Lives Matter movement and the protests around police violence that we saw starting in 2020 and thereafter, and the COVID pandemic, right? And particularly the health disparities that are playing out around COVID. So in both cases, we see that police violence and COVID do not equally affect all people in the United States. Police violence is much more likely to affect African Americans and other people of color. And likewise, the people who are most affected, who are most likely to both get and die from COVID, are people from those particular social groups. So it is not a sort of equally distributed mortality. Some of the reasons for that are other kinds of social inequities. So it's not just COVID that Garth wants to talk about, right? It's more that COVID and the protests in recent years are revealing something that has deep roots, right? So the inequities that are revealed by COVID are not just of this moment. Those inequities didn't start in 2020. It's more that these sort of generations of inequities then play out in terms of who gets and who dies from COVID, right? So African American and Latinx people are much more likely to serve in positions that, for example, did not allow them to go into lockdown. They had to stay on the front lines during the sort of worst moments of the pandemic. And therefore were more likely to be exposed to the virus in the first place. And then also less likely to have the sort of healthcare, testing, etc., access to those resources than others. So more likely to not get sufficient treatment, hospitalization, etc. So if you look at the mortality numbers, they're quite stark, right? The likelihood of dying of COVID goes up precipitously if you are African American or Latinx. So again, Garth is not saying this is a phenomenon that is, born of 2020, but more that COVID-19 and the Black Lives Matter protests are revealing something that is long-standing in our society. One of the key concepts that Garth uses to describe that sort of foundation of inequity is a concept called racial capitalism. And Garth cites the original author of that notion of racial capitalism, Cedric Robinson. You can go ahead and read more about that if you're interested in it. But the concept of racial capitalism is that the historical development of capitalism, so sort of our modern political economic system as it exists in the US and the world more generally, was developed based on racist hierarchies. Think back to what we were talking about European colonization, right? The way the world was reordered in that moment, right, was along the lines not only of certain kinds of political and economic domination, but also along the idea of sort of white supremacy and a sort of racist ideology about more worthy and less worthy categories of people. So the idea of this concept, then, of Robinson's concept, is that sort of racist ideology and those hierarchies were baked into capitalism, right? So in other words, our contemporary society still reflects those ideologies in all kinds of ways. And those inequities that are in sort of every aspect of society have led to things like, ultimately, the uprisings around the Black Lives Matter movement, and also the inequities around COVID. So the idea here is that Garth is using those specific, very recent events and moments as a lens to sort of reveal this much broader set of social disparities and the ways that those are continued through the structures of our society. So again, this is one way to think about how race plays out and how racism plays out through the various channels and the ways that people experience their daily lives, as well as really momentous events like a 100-year pandemic. Okay, well, we'll stop there. And again, I hope you can find ways to connect what we've talked about here with what you're learning in the other two parts of this unit, for a sort of more holistic view of race in the United States, and thinking about how it manifests in individual lives and across societies more generally. So we'll talk again soon. Bye-bye.